Hello everyone, this is Ronnie from YouTube. Thank you for watching again. We're talking health, nutrition, especially related to raw foods, so that's your kind of thing, then maybe you want to watch a video. And today we're going to talk about the diet heart hypothesis. If you look in any nutrition textbook, standard nutrition textbook, university, college level, academic, fully researched, sourced, and everything. It'll talk about, at one point, especially in the section where you're talking about fat, it'll talk about the diet heart hypothesis most likely. So what's the diet heart hypothesis? Well, this goes back to I think it's the 1950s or the 1960s, maybe a little bit before that even. And there was a study called the 7 Countries Study, done by a guy called Ancel Keys, who was a scientist. And Ancel Keys was involved in the Second World War in creating like the rations that soldiers got or something like that. So he was quite a well-respected scientist in that area. And the 7 Countries Study, as far as I can make out, was a study where they were comparing the lifestyles, the diets of different countries, and the amount of cardiovascular disease that was happening, essentially heart disease, because that was starting to become a big problem, and it was becoming the major thing that most people died from, and it kind of still is basically today, or it's right up there. And this 7 countries study was comparing different countries, and it was trying to find out, it was the start of the process of finding out what was the thing that most correlated to heart disease. What was the nutrient or the lifestyle, the diet or whatever it was. And there was an assumption, I believe, that high blood pressure was kind of the cause or was related to it. And they compared these different countries, but what they found was Japan had very high blood pressure. And the reason for that is they have a very high salt diet, or they did back then. But they had very low incidence of cardiovascular disease. So they were comparing things like that. They were looking at different factors and working out, right, why does this country seem to have high rates, this country has low rates, and so on. And this study was the first thing that showed basically the correlation was most strong for saturated fat. I think they also tried to see if total fat had the effect, but it was actually saturated fat. And some people argued with that and said it was actually protein, but the further evidence that went into this discovered it was saturated fat. Now, people in the low carb movement, in the paleo movement, carnivore, whatever, they claim all of this is nonsense and that all this research was cherry picked. And the reason they say that is because the 7 countries study eliminated a whole bunch of countries. So they came up with a chart, they came up with the amount of saturated fat in the diet, and they came up with the amount of cardiovascular disease, and it all matched, but some people were saying, well, they've taken a whole bunch of countries out, which is true. But the reason they took a lot of those countries out is because the information was not going to be as good. The countries themselves didn't have a very high standard of scientific reputation or whatever. Some of them were going through war at the time, so that was really skewing the figures. So imagine if our country went through war and all of a sudden everyone had to eat a diet of just potatoes and vegetables and some fruits. Well, obviously, heart disease would basically disappear. The reason we know that is because that actually happened in the Second World War, where rationing and taking away all these foods and areas going on vegetarian diets and the heart disease disappeared or went right down, and the diabetes disappeared and went right down. So we've seen that happen before. So I'm just thinking what point I was getting at there. So yeah, so we've seen that happen, and basically with the 7 country study and other studies at that time, we're really looking into this seriously, and they looked at all the different avenues of what this could be and what the relationship was. They looked at studies, for example, as we're saying, of what happened during wartime when the diets changed. They looked at other countries like Uganda, where they only found like one incidence of heart disease in like thousands of people. And even that, it wasn't even fatal. It was like a heart attack that healed, that the person didn't die from, and it healed up. All of that moved towards the hypothesis that basically saturated fat is the major cause of heart disease. And therefore, the hypothesis that would come from that is that therefore we should try and, well, and what their suggestion was, replace saturated fat with unsaturated fats. So that was when things like margarines and plant fats and different things and things like that started to be tested to see if they were better. I think they do have some effect, but what has made this all a bit unclear is that they have done a number of studies where they've reduced saturated fat in the diet, and it doesn't seem to have shown a lot of effect in terms of, or sometimes it doesn't, or it's not very powerful, or whatever it is. And the reason for that is, or rather, they've looked at the information of, say, the average population. They've looked at the people with a lower saturated fat diet, people with a higher, and they've often, there's been times when they've not seen a great deal of difference. And the reason for that really is that it needs to be a much lower, like no one is on a low enough saturated fat diet for it to reverse their heart disease, or for it to protect them from heart disease. So if someone's on 30% of their diet or 40% of their diet is fat and it goes down to 35%, that's not making a huge difference to anyone. It needs to come way down. So that's the kind of problem that we've got nutrition wise, of why haven't they just come out and said, this is the diet that protects against heart disease, this is what you have to do, you need to cut out all these saturated fats in animal products. It's because it's still kind of unclear, but from the evidence we've seen of Dean Ornish and Caldwell Esselstyn and a few others, we've seen studies where people have reversed heart disease on a properly low fat diet, and there's a lot of more evidence that will back that up as well. So that's really the diet heart hypothesis. Quite interesting to read about it and read the history of it, but be aware that it will be skewed. And when people talk about this, they'll tell you, Ancel Keys cherry-picked information. They lied to the scientific community, and everyone's just like accepted that lie. Well, that doesn't happen in science. People don't just accept what you say just because you're Ancel Keys or just because you're a famous scientist. They're going to look at what you say and study it. And many people have studied it, and many people have tried to pick holes in it. But we keep on coming back to the fact saturated fat is the thing that leads to heart disease. Saturated fat increases blood cholesterol. LDL, which is the bad cholesterol, which gets essentially starts to build up in your arteries and starts to create these blockages. That is the process that happens and leads towards heart disease. So this is a very clear thing. This is very, very clear that this happens. So when people are moving towards a very high saturated fat diet, this is really worrying. It's really worrying that people are doing that, because the impact is well known of what happens, that it creates these diseases over time, not forever. But my real prediction is that the people that have went to low carb diets or went off vegan diets to a carnivore diet, is that they are mostly going to introduce more carbohydrates into their diet, and they will end up on basically back to the standard diet, which is the thing that they tried to get away from years ago. So it's really kind of funny to me that all these people started off on the standard American diet. Lots of people didn't have good health, or didn't have as good performance as they wanted, or didn't feel as good as they wanted, or some of them were had ruined their health and had major disease and stuff like that. And they've went on this journey to veganism, plant-based, maybe raw food, fasting, all these things. And now it just seems like so many of them are just going right back to where they started off, which is back to the standard diet. And to me that's a little bit of a shame. I think it's very hard to maintain a low carb diet long term. I've not tried it myself, but I can imagine that it is very, very hard to maintain that. And probably kind of boring and stuff like that. So that's my prediction, is a lot of people will, and I think a lot of them are on just, they're just back to the standard diet. They're just back to cooked starches, meat, animal products, and they're probably going to introduce all sorts of other things. And I can't imagine anyone coming from a plant-based diet or a raw food diet going back to that could honestly say this is better, that they would feel better. Your body can adapt to it over time. I personally wouldn't want to go through that. But yeah, so one of the main things for me, health-wise, that inspires me to stay on a low-fat and raw vegan path is the diet heart hypothesis. It's staying away from damaging your arteries like that. That's one of the main things for me. Human beings are not carnivores. We don't deal with meat very well. We don't deal with high saturated fat diets very well. So thank you for watching the video. If you've got any questions about that, you can feel free to comment below, or you can go to your local library, pick up a nutrition textbook, and look up the section. You'll probably find the diet heart hypothesis. You'll probably be able to read about it. It's not that difficult to understand, and you'll be able to explain that to other people. So thank you for watching. Subscribe, click the notification, share. If you've got any questions, leave a comment below, and keep your heart healthy.